Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG event. We're very excited this evening for an incredible panel on eco-horror and looking forward to hearing from our brilliant panelists. If I could just ask participants to, if I could just ask guests, sorry, to keep their cameras and microphones off. Just so that we can manage bandwidth and so on. Please do feel free to use the chat, but keep your questions for the panel just until Lindsay opens up questions about 8 o'clock. She'll ask you at that point to either pop questions in the chat or put your hand up or what have you. But that just means that Lindsay doesn't get questions lost and can find everybody, and nobody's question gets missed. So feel free to use the chat, but just hang on to your questions. So I'm going to introduce our chair tonight, who is Dr. Lindsay Hallam. Lindsay is a senior lecturer in film at the University of East London. She's the author of Screening the Marquis de Sade, Pleasure, Pain and the Transgressive Body in Film, and Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me in the Devil's Advocate series, which is a fantastic book. And she is currently researching a monograph on revenge in Australian horror cinema, which we're very excited to say is coming out with the SIG's book series, Hidden Horror Histories, with Liverpool University Press. So I'm going to hand over to Lindsay, and she's going to introduce our panelists. Thanks very much, Lindsay.
All right. So we're here to talk about eco-horror. And just before we begin, I am juggling screens and I am slightly impaired. This is not a fashion accessory, as someone asked me in the pub the other night. This is actually because I fractured my finger. So I'm operating between different screens and windows, and hopefully things are going to not go haywire. So I want to thank you all for coming today. And I want to introduce our amazing panel. Like, for this topic, I don't think we could have got a better panel. So I'll start off just introducing everyone, and I'm going to go alphabetically. So I'm going to start with Kaja Franck, who is a lecturer in English literature and creative writing at the University of Hertfordshire. Her thesis looked at the literary werewolf as an eco-gothic monster. She's published on the depiction of wolves and werewolves in Dracula and young adult fiction, most recently writing about werewolves, gender and race in Ginger Snaps Back for the Gothic Studies Journal, also on the wilderness in modern Gothic, and co-authoring a chapter on contemporary werewolves for 21st century Gothic, which was edited by Marcia Wester and Xavier Aldana Reyes. She also examines how the eco-Gothic intersects with fairies, trolls and shark horror in film and novels. And her latest research project, Dance Macabre, explores the Gothic quality of ballet and other dance forms, and she's a member of the Open Graves, Open Minds project, analysing depictions of monsters in popular culture. Next up, we have Dawn Keetley, who is a professor of English and film, teaching horror and Gothic at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She's the author of Making a Monster, Jesse Pomeroy, the Boy Murderer. Sorry, see, now my screens have gone weird. Excuse me. Author of Making a Monster, Jesse Pomeroy, the Boy Murderer of 1870s Boston, and has edited or co-edited books on folk horror, Jordan Peele's Get Out, plant horror, the eco-Gothic in 19th century literature, and The Walking Dead. Next up, we have Dr. Catherine Lester. Again, I am struggling a bit with screens, who is a lecturer in film and television at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on the intersection between children's culture and the horror genre, and her publications include the monograph Horror Films for Children, Fear and Pleasure in American Cinema, and the edited collection Watership Down, Perspectives on and Beyond Animated Violence, which is just about to come out. Her own chapter combines childhood studies and eco-critical concepts to situate Watership Down's Bloody Bunnies within the history of rabbits in the horror genre and children's culture. And then we have Dr. Kaylee Simmons, Oglala Lakota, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Nations Studies at Portland State University. In her research, she examines Indigenous representations in literature and film with a focus on horror, science fiction, and ethnographic genre works. Her work has been published in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Science Fiction, Film and Television, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and vulture.com. So, hello, everybody. So I guess we should maybe just start off with, if someone wants to kind of try and define what eco-horror is or what kind of films we're talking about. So we could start off, I guess, with Kat, since I guess the publication of your edited collection is kind of prompted this whole discussion.
Hi, thank you, Lindsay. Now I'm like, oh gosh, I have to define it. I did actually, I've taught on eco-horror, sort of. I taught on the film Little Shop of Horrors, the musical version, which is a big favorite of mine. And so I guess, trying to cast my mind back now to a year ago when I taught that, I suppose eco-horror is any kind of horror film or whichever media, your media of preference, which uses the conventions of the horror genre to encourage us to reflect on or raise our awareness about any kind of issues to do with our environment and the ways that we interact with it.
Yeah. Dawn, I know you've published very widely on this subject. If there's anything you kind of want to continue on from?
Yes, that was a great first stab. And I guess I would say, just to sort of extend what Kat just said, that I think eco-horror probably, like, one of the things it does when it's using horror conventions to reflect on, issues involving the environment, it usually destabilizes anthropocentrism. I mean, I figured, like, in this panel, we would need to have some sort of definition. And that was the first thing I wrote down, that eco-horror in some way destabilizes the human at the center of the plot, whether it's visually or narratively. And that it also, I guess I would just throw out there, because the more I was thinking about this, I wonder if there isn't really a tension between the eco and the horror. The eco part references the environment and ecology and sort of the interconnectedness of all life. And I feel like the more interesting eco-horror does reflect that interconnectedness. I think Ben Wheatley's In the Earth is a great example, as is an Irish film called Without Name. But in some ways, the more fully you kind of get into the ecological perspective, the less horror the film becomes. Because I think if ecology is all about sort of being interwoven, horror is about borders and violence and separation and borders. So I'll leave that there for now, but those were just some of the things I was thinking of.
And one of the things, like, I've written, I'm at the moment researching a book on revenge in Australian horror cinema. Yeah. And when people usually think of Australian horror, some of the things that come to mind are things like Razorback and things about kind of rampaging animals. And one of the things that I always come across, in these films is that this theme of revenge. It's avenging something. So you mentioned something about destabilizing, the anthropocentric. So it also feels like something like we are being held to account. Humanity is being held to account. We've got to answer for some of our crimes. There's the great Australian film Long Weekend from 1978, and the tagline for that was nature found them guilty, basically, is the tagline of the film. So I think there's so much about the non-human, that aspect to it, and that in many ways the non-human becomes, I guess in some ways, the monster. We have all these rampaging animals, but yet also I find, certainly as an animal lover, that often your sympathy is always with usually the rampaging animal, and the people being attacked to kind of, you know, they deserve it.
That's why, if I could just jump in to mention Little Shop of Horrors again, which is why I much prefer the original director's cut of the film, which was also the end of the stage musical, where the plant wins and spawns lots of other plants and they all take over the world, which is not only just a lot of fun, but Audrey too, the plant, is probably the most enjoyable character, and maybe not the most sympathetic. Audrey is also pretty sympathetic, but I think there's something about films like that just don't offer the catharsis of humans winning or surviving. Or I think that is a catharsis in its own kind of way, that just like destruction of the world and humans just die off, and it's just, that's the end.
I don't know, Kaja, you've done a lot of work on animals and animal horror. If you kind of want to talk about, you know, why the animal is so central to eco horror.
Well, I can, and I've been thinking and listening to Kat and Dawn, and like they're putting these really intellectual and really good theoretical basis. And I keep going back to when I tried to explain my thesis to my dad, who does not have a GCSE. So for those of you who are from sort of other examples, essentially it's the ordinary wizarding levels. He doesn't have an ordinary wizarding level in English literature, is what I tend to use there. And he said, well, what is this? What is it you study? And I said, well, I study eco-Gothic. And I was like, the best example is, you know, when you watch Jaws? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, did you want to get in the water afterwards? And he went, no. And I went, that is eco-horror and eco-Gothic. And I was like, all I do is try and explain how that happened. Like, what is it in the film that makes you feel like that beyond the obvious? And why does that matter? Why does it matter that we're now scared of sharks? The other, that's basically my tagline there. The other thing I think about is, when we're also thinking about both the animals and the environment, is a really funny thing I saw on Twitter once, and it was a meme, and it was this beautiful pine forest. And it was like, if you go into the forest, you might find yourself, and someone had crossed it out and just written, you might get killed. And I was like, yes, that is also it. Can I put that in the appendix of my thesis? So yeah, I think for me, it is about decentering the human. And it's also, in some ways, it can be reactionary or it can be revolutionary. And the revolutionary makes us question, should we be allowed to do that? The animal's revenge makes us think, what have we done wrong? Do we deserve this? But if you look at some of the earlier examples, they're definitely reactionary, in which they are saying, look, these are really scary animals, and they're kind of adding extra ballast to why we should destroy certain populations. So for me, wolves in particular is the one that comes to mind, and they're depicted as these sort of preternatural, supernatural beings, to such a degree, in a way to assuage the guilt of the humans who just want to destroy these populations, would be my offering on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, having grown up in Australia, I know what it's like, where everything can kill you. Like we used to go on like field trips, and you'd have to tuck the bottoms of your trousers, of your pants, into your socks, because snakes could like get up your trousers and stuff like that. And like there's a whole beach culture, and I always hated the beach, and I'm like, well, yeah, nothing in the ocean wants you to be there. And if ever there was a shark attack, suddenly they'd want to kill the shark, and it would always seem like just so wrong to me. And so again, going back to like my kind of work in terms of looking at Australian horror films and revenge, and for me, the main thing is being revenge is colonialism. It's those are the people, that's what needs to be avenged. And Keetley, I know you've worked a lot with looking at the rise of kind of Indigenous representation and also people behind the camera as well. So, and also working, looking at kind of, for want of a better word, post-colonial, which means somehow, I always have a problem with that term, because it seems to mean that it's over, which is not. But I just wanted you to kind of talk about some of your approaches to eco-horror?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that this conversation has brought up. I think as someone who studies indigenous literature and indigenous cultural productions, it's kind of interesting because I think something like the eco-Gothic tends not to exist in indigenous epistemologies, which is kind of interesting. It's usually not about, I mean, there are stories, right, of people, you know, not honoring their relationships to certain other species or certain lands, and facing, you know, consequences for that. But I think one of the things in eco-horror that's kind of interesting is that it makes the kind of speculative jump of like, well, what if, you know, animals had the same kind of agency as human beings? And in many indigenous frameworks, animals do have the same kind of agency as human beings. And so it's not animals acting like human beings that is inherently frightening. It's more so, what have human beings done not to sort of honor their relations? And why is that? Why is that sort of something we need to be cognizant of? And then the other point I was thinking about, which now I have lost, was thinking about the kind of human too. I think one of the things that a lot of work in Black and Indigenous studies has sort of brought forward is that the Anthropocene is a kind of useful tool, but it also needs to be sort of utilized with the framework that it's not all of human beings that have transformed the environment in these really negative ways and implemented all of these harmful policies. It's certain kinds of human beings. And as a Native person who, since, you know, the Pope divided the world into different parts, has largely not been considered a human being, I think about that too, of what might it mean that Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the human, and how that might explain the ways that we often sort of slip into the environment. Because that's something I think about a lot, is how notions of indigeneity sort of feed into these kinds of fears of the environment, right? Because if the people who are occupying, or the non-persons, I guess, who are occupying that place are terrifying, that works to sort of build this terror of the environment. So I'm interested in that relationship too, of how the environment sort of gets coded through its relationship to Black and Indigenous peoples. See?
Because I've always wondered if that was a slightly problematic element of eco-horror, that there's almost this evasion of, especially, I mean, again, I keep going back to an Australian context because that's what I know, evasion of the injustice and the genocide that has happened to the Indigenous people, and kind of shifted it onto animals as a way. It's all, yeah, like you said, it seems very coded that it's a kind of a way to kind of maybe assuage some guilt and some shame, but yet still not dealing with really what's happened.
Yeah, and that's also really common in like what we would call backwoods horror in the United States, right? So instead of the kind of Indigenous person, you have like a redneck that becomes sort of indigenized through their, distance from quote unquote civilization, right? Their improper relationships that they build with the environment, right? And so I'm interested in those kinds of re-encodings, right? I have a list of movies that I'm developing that are like, these are movies that are about Native people, but that don't have Native people in them. And often we have these kinds of recodings like you're talking about, either through animals or through this kind of like redneck figure.
And so a lot of the most well-known eco-horror films seem to come from North America or Australia, which are these colonized lands. And when I teach eco-horror here in the UK, often I'll talk to students, and one of the things I'll do is like come up with what can you do as a British eco-horror film, and they've often come up with films of ideas about rampaging, I don't know, squirrels and pigeons and all sorts of things. Someone came up with the title Kew Garden Massacre, which Kew Garden is this very kind of posh English garden that you can go and visit, and this whole idea of it all going crazy. So Kat, given that you've got this book on Watership Down, which is very British, can you talk about the idea of a British eco-horror, or about what Watership Down in particular. How is Watership Down placed within this discussion?
Yeah, I think that Watership Down, I can definitely speak on Watership Down, maybe not so much British horror more widely, but Watership Down, I think, increasingly is being considered within the category of folk horror, which is very strongly associated with British horror, like The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw. But I should say that Dawn did an excellent paper looking at Watership Down as folk horror many years ago now, so she may be able to speak on this as well. As an example of a British possible eco-horror or folk horror film, it's interesting the way that it's drawing on very pastoral imagery. And in other instances, and that pastoral imagery is very sort of grounded in realism, and then that contrasts against these very surreal moments of horrible visions, dreams, which almost clashing together, almost these two very, very different types of Britishness butting up against one another. Yeah, I don't know if Dawn, I feel like I'm rambling incoherently, but Dawn might be able to chime in a bit on this as a folk horror expert as well.
Sorry, yeah, my screen's got messed up a bit there too. I have a thought on that, because I was trying to figure out, I do have thoughts on folk horror and eco horror, like lots of them. But there's actually a really interesting British eco horror film. It's Welsh, called The Feast, directed by Lehigh Jones, from 2021. I don't know if people have heard about that, but I would highly recommend it. And it is a revenge narrative, in that, you know, it's about sort of mining for minerals in a part of the Welsh countryside that's considered by some to be sacred, and there's a spirit that kind of arises and takes over a body and then kills everyone. So it's a really interesting version of the revenge narrative, and I'm not sure, and the director tried to make it specifically Welsh. He was trying to make a non-English eco horror film, and but as Welsh as it is in its location, I think it does kind of dramatize the sort of standard revenge of nature narrative, which I was going to ask people if they, what people's thoughts are about the revenge of nature narrative, since it's been pretty thoroughly critiqued, and yet film after film is coming out that continues that tradition. I just saw Beast with Idris Elba in it, where a male lion just goes around slaughtering poachers that killed its pride. And so the lion has that kind of human intent that Jaws gets in the entire franchise. But, I wonder if that isn't anthropocentrizing, if that's a word, animals and turning them into versions of the human. So I sort of had that question for people, or I wanted to raise that, like, what value is the revenge of nature narrative? It's clearly very powerful. We see text after text come out that sort of follows that narrative thread. But isn't it just adhering a little bit too closely to what we understand, to emotions that humans understand, and not really tapping into other kinds of motivations, ways of being, ontologies, all of that. But I just had also wanted to really, I thought what Kaylee said earlier was great, and kind of made me think of Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, Back to America, I guess, as sort of a really early instance of the eco-Gothic that really aligns animals and indigenous people. You know, at a certain point, young Goodman Brown is running through the forest, and he's afraid of the animals, and he's afraid of the savage Indians and the black man, who is the devil. So it's kind of all rolled up into one. This sort of fear of the woods, of the animals in the woods, of the people in the woods, and the people associated with the woods. And so it's definitely this one particular, you know, colonizing kind of human that is at the center of the standard eco-Gothic story, I guess.
I was wondering, like, this is what my brain does. It tries to connect everything in one giant thing, and then that's a nightmare for everyone to hear. But I was really interesting. I'm looking at what Kaylee has said in regard, like the US indigenous politics falls under the management of national parks. Then I was thinking about the conversation I was having with my students today, with how like the concept of slavery is just removed from British culture. Even though we were highly involved in it, we're just like, but it didn't, yeah, but we didn't see it. So did it really happen though? And it kind of interestingly sort of links together through the idea of nature. Now, I should say that I'm more of a literary background than a film background, so apologies. But along my never-ending journey to bore my family to death, whenever I take my family to a stately home, and they're typically sort of Regency area stately homes, I always go, oh, I wonder if this is Capability Brown. And then I go, would you like to hear about how the construction of this landscape is very similar to how Gothic literature functions in this period? And they go, no, absolutely not. Shut up. Can we get an ice cream? So for those of you who are here, and I assume you're interested in this, it's a really similar idea where the grounds that Capability Brown creates perform this wilderness, this natural landscape, even though we know that it's highly cultivated, it's constructed. You have the things like follies with this sort of like idea of like historical ruins, which we see all these tropes in early Gothic literature. In the same way, I'd argue that's basically what wilderness parks or national parks in the United States of America did. Like, you go in there and you have a version of wilderness that's being described, like with John Muir talking about Yosemite, like saying, like, I got there and it was like a natural cathedral and there was no one there. I couldn't see a single person. Definitely no people, these weird clearings that just beautifully exist. Clearly no humans were involved. And then the creation of those is about a creation of wilderness that is necessary to a conceptualization of civilization as a binary, but also as real humans, proper humans, which, as Kaylee said, pushes out the existence of indigenous people. And of course, that's really similar to kind of what was on the Celtic fringes in the UK. I think we tend to forget that, like, we got our colonialism, we got to grips with it within the United Kingdoms, within the British Isles. And it was almost like, and then we expanded that beyond the actual island itself. So that would be some of my connecting thoughts, bringing it all together. And of course, similar within Australia as well, and the role of wilderness in Australia.
Yeah, I think the creation of this idea of wilderness is really interesting, because to me, when I read a lot of eco-horror texts, I kind of find it kind of funny. I don't know, maybe that just shows my weird reading practices, but like earlier in the term, I was teaching Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo to my students, and I just found myself kind of laughing and guffawing at how he, like you say, Kaja, for him, the environment literally becomes like a weapon. Like he talks about the rocks are monsters, the trees are these spears. And to me, it reads, again, like other folks have said, as this kind of projection of a kind of colonizing mindset onto the environment, right? The Western human, I would say, enters into the wilderness with the intent of conquest, and thus sort of projects, right, this idea of conquest back onto the environment, right? I treated you this way, so now you're going to treat me this way. And yeah, I'm just thinking about like indigenous texts that take up relationships between humans and animals in the land. I'm thinking like of Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians, which I just taught, which has this kind of like monstrous deer elk woman who comes to take revenge. But the sort of interesting turn that he takes on that is that, yes, it follows the kind of traditional eco-Gothic narrative where these men sort of, kill this herd of elk, and that sort of spurs on the revenge. But also Elkhead Woman, the sort of antagonist of the novel, also sort of her revenge spins out of control as well. So we see this kind of paralleling between these four Native men who have taken more than they deserve, and these Elkhead woman who also starts to take more than she deserves. And it takes another kind of force to move in to kind of mediate this cycle of violence too, to say like, okay, no, we have to stop and we have to sort of honor our relations. So yeah, so I've been thinking about that too in relation to this, and how the wilderness as a space, the creation of that space, the clearing of Indigenous peoples from that space, and the labor of Indigenous peoples from that space helps to do a lot of work to kind of set up this setting of terror.
I mean, I wonder if, and maybe Australia, in my mind at least, and certainly as the way you described it, Lindsay, is the exception here. I mean, I wonder if there's any land in which a narrative we could call eco-Gothic or eco-horror is set that isn't a completely constructed and scripted and shaped land. And so from the very beginning, that experience of supposed wilderness is just the experience of something we've created, and what we've done to it is getting projected back to us. Now, I do feel Australia is the exception. It seems, having never been there, it seems like there's possibly like real dangerous wildness there.
And the thing is that there are obviously in Australia there, I mean, especially as you go towards the center, in many ways it becomes quite uninhabitable. It gets very, very, very hot during the day and very, very cold at night. But I think that there's also in Australia there is this narrative, and I think, and I look back at something that I wrote, the first thing I wrote about eco horror, and I talked about basically I said like the Australian outback is kind of harsh and uninviting. And I think that is actually a really colonialist point of view, because people had been living there for tens of thousands of years, and they know how to live there. And there was, even when we had the bushfires, I think at the beginning of 2020, that kind of almost signaled what 2020 was going to be. We had these terrible bushfires, and people had to go to Indigenous communities because they knew how to manage like controlled burns and things like that. And so it was actually, they have the knowledge. So it's this whole idea of, from I guess a white perspective, that this land is harsh and uninviting, and we'll never be able to know it. And in some ways you just shouldn't be there. But I think that and hopefully maybe that's something that's happening more now, is that actually going back to the I guess the knowledge that people who Indigenous habitants have of, and actually kind of changing the way we look at the nature and look at the land, hopefully. And certainly I guess in cinema, the fact that hopefully we have more people telling stories, because especially when you look at a lot of eco horror, it is all pretty much from a white perspective. And like in Australia, we had a really great anthology film come out a couple of years ago called Dark Place, which was all by Indigenous filmmakers, and they were all looking at. In fact, it's a really great film, and that it uses so many different kind of horror subgenres, and gives this different point of view to it. But just going back to something that Dawn mentioned before, is how do we make this distinction between folk horror and eco horror? Because in many ways they are so similar. This whole idea of, especially the land itself, I guess, becoming kind of sentient, or having this character to it. And we can probably, we'll go into plant horror in a bit, I think, as well. But yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how do we make a distinction as something is eco horror or folk horror? Because that's something that came up when I was teaching eco horror, that students were seemingly kind of confusing eco horror and folk horror. So I don't know if anyone can kind of figure out where the distinction lies.
I mean, I could take a stab at it. That's probably pretty superficial, but I think you just have folk in folk horror. Okay, that's really that is really superficial. But I guess, and you have to have people in eco horror, obviously, because just to sort of sum up the strands that I think people have been saying, like, it's not clear you can actually have horror amidst people who live in complete harmony with nature. There needs to be some sort of alienation of the people from the land for there to be horror. So there have to be people in eco horror. I guess I would say, just to start the conversation, maybe folk horror centers, a community, often one at odds with modernity and progress. And thus they often do live in some degree of harmony with the land, but sort of they're the center. I would distinguish eco horror as being a narrative that really pushes toward putting the non-human at the center. Maybe not at first, but as the narrative goes along, the non-human just comes from the background to the foreground. I think in folk horror, perhaps the community always sort of keeps its place at the center, however tenuously, maybe.
That was for me. I'll use that. So if we're getting to the land, so plants. So obviously Last of Us was the big hit recently, and that had the kind of fungal horror, which also, the Girl with All the Gifts also had that as well. And I know, again, Dawn, you're kind of the go-to person here. If you could kind of talk about plant horror and how that sits within eco horror.
Well, as I learned when doing the plant horror book, I guess fungus is completely different. And we got some really good abstracts on fungal horror even back then. I think it's kind of exploded since we were working on that collection. But we actually did have a debate, and as somebody who knew very little about plants at the time, I was like, well, are mushrooms plants? I don't know, but no, whole different genus or whatever. I mean, to talk about fungus, there have been a whole lot of articles in the US news recently about fungal infections, like tearing through hospitals. And I've read people talking about the fact that fungus may actually be the way the world ends, at least the human part of the world. So they are pretty scary. And I think the thing about fungi that work really well, and perhaps is different from plants, is that fungus creeps and it overtakes you, and it's not necessarily always visible. The spores aren't necessarily always available to sight. And I think a lot of the fungal horror, like The Last of Us and some of the other fungal zombies, you're not really aware of what's happening. Plants maintain a separate existence a little bit more clearly. But fungi just, they can work on us from the inside out. That's pretty scary.
So yeah, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And I did not realize plants and fungus are not the same thing. All right, I stand corrected.
I'm pretty sure that's the case, but that's about as far as my knowledge of the different types go. So.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, Kat, you mentioned that you use Little Shop of Horrors just to keep on the plant thing. How does plant? I've never thought of Little Shop of Horrors as kind of eco horror.
Yeah, well, apparently some of my students struggled with it too, but I think that was because they couldn't really get their heads around thinking about it as horror at all. Which I know is like a discussion that's been had several times on these BAFTSS SIG panels, which we probably don't need to rehearse here. But I think what I really enjoy about that film is that although it starts off with this big plant as sort of the villain, at least in the original cut and in the musical, it the humans can't win, and it also almost like presents a version of the world, or at least this little area of I think it's New York, where everything's just kind of awful, and you have Audrey the human, not Audrey 2, the plant, who's dreaming of this suburban utopia where she wants to live to get out of the city. And what she gets in the end is a different kind of green place, which is being, spoilers, eaten by a giant plant, which goes on to take over the world. And there is something about that sort of complete refusal to satisfy any kind of a happy ending that I really appreciate. Someone else, we've already mentioned The Girl with All the Gifts, which does something similar, but in that case, it's really flipping on its head that idea of children as this hopeful symbol for the future, or rather than flipping it on its head, it's kind of taking that to the logical extreme, which is essentially adults can't survive in the world anymore. It's another kind of fungal horror film, or Sporer, as someone said in the chat, a fungal horror film where there are these certain children who are unaffected by it and can move around the world, and ordinary adults can't. If they're exposed to it, they'll die. And there's this, the film ends with basically all the adults, apart from one who's kept to educate the children, who is left alive, and all the other adults die, and the world just becomes, it belongs to the children. And it's like, yeah, children are the future, but where are the adults? They're gone. And there's just something I find really cathartic about that sort of, what's the word, nihilism.
But just following on from that, I mean, when I teach eco horror, you know, most of my students are, you know, late teens, early 20s, and you know this, and I also have, you know, a niece who's 17, 18 years old, and I think that this, especially, you know, the younger generation, they have such anxiety about the environment and about the future or the not future. And I guess if you look at like the first 70s eco horror films, it was all just set in a small town, and you know, and they kind of, you know, something goes on a rampage, and then they kind of contain it, although, oh, actually it's laid eggs or had babies, and the cycle continues, but it's not that threatening. And then post 2000, things get so apocalyptic, and I think, yeah, I think maybe there's a timeliness, certainly, I think, to eco horror, because it is playing into the big fears. In fact, I was just reading something today that was like something like I can't remember, it was like children and teenagers that were asked what their fears about the future and about the environment, and over 50% of them said they were worried, and or 84% of them said that they were worried, and there was a like just under, I think it was like 25 or 25% or something that said that they are extremely worried. So it's just something that I think, yeah, whenever I teach this, it becomes a talk about the environment and about, you know, this is our biggest fear. So I'm wondering if you, you know, if you think about, is that playing into, you know, are these films just playing that up, or is there any hope to be had, or what is the place of eco horror in terms of, you know, yeah, our concerns about the environment? Is it just exploiting those fears?
I guess I think it's really interesting, because I think this actually comes back to something that Kaylee said about our idea of knowledge. and how Indigenous epistemologies are very different to Western epistemologies, and how we are obsessed. So much horror is about what is natural and unnatural. And if I could have one wish in the world, it'd be that no one is allowed to use the term natural to describe anything unless they've written a thesis on it. Because, oh, I gave birth recently, and let me tell you, that was a mind trip of people policing what is natural and unnatural, simply based, as we all have seen with vaccine sort of deniers, simply based on their own comfort zones, essentially. But I'm also particularly interested because I think a lot of our fear about the apocalypse is a fear of the unknown. And a lot of our fears in eco-horror is about things that aren't acting in a way that we think is natural, in inverted commas. And yet one of the things that I read that was really interesting or useful, and I might do a module on it, is how much that idea of apocalypse is really predicated on the idea that we're in the West, and we kind of think we deserve one at this point. Whereas a lot of Indigenous populations, and I'm sure, Katie, you can say a lot more about this, are like, yeah, we've been through apocalypse. You brought it to us. So yeah, it seems like a very Western fear and obsession. Be an idea there.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, is I think if we think back to like 70s eco-horror, the eco-horror film I'm super fascinated with is Prophecy, which is about the contamination of an Indigenous water supply with mercury poisoning that's based on actual events that were happening contemporaneous to the film being released in the 70s. So basically, you know, your entire source of food, your entire source of water becomes unusable, right? And so Indigenous people, as you said, have experienced many apocalypses. And to me, I find the sort of contemporary interest in apocalyptic, apocalyptic fiction's been a big thing for a long time, but I think the ongoing interest in apocalyptic fiction is that perhaps, and especially about the environment now, is perhaps that certain populations are starting to feel an apocalypse that many other populations have been feeling for a long, long time. In terms of the nihilism of the apocalypse, I think, you know, there's a couple Indigenous stories that I can share that I think sort of flip that nihilism on the head. The first is I attended a talk a couple years ago about some researchers that were working with Indigenous communities up in Washington, just a couple hours from where I am now. And there is a site in Washington where a lot of nuclear waste has been buried. And basically that area has become so contaminated that Indigenous people can no longer visit that sacred site. And the researchers asked the Indigenous folks about how they felt that they couldn't go to this place anymore. And a couple elders responded, what if this is the mountain protecting itself, that no one can come visit it anymore? And that, you know, eventually it will be better and we will still be around, we'll be able to go see it. And that's the sort of flip of the nihilism. Another one that I think about a lot now that I shared with my students and I think kind of freaked them out is that my people, the Lakota, our emergent story, our story of how we came to be in this world, is an apocalyptic story. So we, a group of Lakota people basically emerged from underneath the earth before the earth was ready for them. They were tricked by Iktomi, who's like our sort of trickster figure for the Lakota. And they were punished for emerging onto the earth too early by being transformed into buffalo. And so I've now joked with my students that, you know, sometimes when I see really bad things happening in the world, I think, okay, maybe tomorrow I will wake up and I will be a buffalo. And it will just be a sign that perhaps human beings emerged onto the earth too early. And whatever is going to come after us is going to be human beings. And I think that I find that very comforting, but I think that also maybe freaks students out. When I say, well, I can wake up and be a buffalo. It's not like, you know, like, like I'm waking up and I'm a bug. But I think, yeah, there's a sense from an Indigenous epistemologies that that even though the apocalypse happened, we are still here. I think that's why everyone on Native Twitter was like freaking out when there were Native characters in The Last of Us, and they were like, yeah, we would still be around, we would still be hanging out and being cute aunties and uncles and like hanging out. And so I think for us, there is a lot of hope that we haven't sort of been ground down into the nihilism that I see in a lot of Western apocalyptic fiction.
And also, I guess a lot of, I'm reminded of a quote from Everett de Roche, who wrote the Australian film Long Weekend. He talked about, that this idea of, I guess it relates to like the Gaia theory, where he says, my premise was that Mother Earth has her own autoimmune system. So when humans start behaving like cancer cells, she attacks. And so, I think there's another aspect of eco-horror seems to be this idea of, the Earth itself, again, going back to maybe to revenge, or that we are an invading, like we are the virus, we are this contagion, we are this cancer. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about this idea of like the embodiment of the Earth itself. Yep, Dawn.
Well, I was just going to say, because this is just continuing the thread of kind of rethinking revenge and nihilism, that one way to understand, eco-horror revenge narratives is it's not about our fear, it's not about ecophobia, or it is about ecophobia, but maybe it's also about our hope that the world is greater than we are, and that, the lions will stop us, the mountain will stop us, the plants will stop us, before we do get to the point of destroying everything. So that's kind of a way to rethink the revenge narrative as more hopeful in a kind of perverse way, than it is nihilistic. And I just wanted to point out, if people haven't read Catherine Yusuf's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or Non, that's another way to think about the ways different humans have experienced the apocalypse differently, repeatedly, rather than sort of it's being some future event that hasn't happened yet.
I think to respond to the humans are a virus thing, I'll post a link to a resource in the chat. A colleague of mine, April Anson, and some other folks created this zine called Against the Eco-Fascist Creep, that directly sort of works to undo that kind of rising narrative, right, of like, oh, humans are the virus, and once we go away, blah, blah, blah. And this ignores a lot of human history, where, people were living and not causing catastrophic climate change. And this idea actually, emerges in relation to a lot of fascist thinking. And so I point to people towards that research because I think it does a great job of sort of unpacking all of these sort of myths around kind of climate catastrophe, right? This idea that humans are a virus, that cities are a problem, things like that. It's a really great resource.
Awesome. Yeah. And we've got the last few minutes here before we can open it up. So people start thinking about your questions and maybe start putting them in the chat. So just to, I guess just to end, I maybe just go around and people recommend eco-horror films. So if anyone has an eco-horror film, maybe something you've really wanted to talk about that we haven't mentioned, if anyone has any examples that they just want to get out there.
Things.
Yep.
I have two good ones. I don't know if they fit into eco-horror, but they do talk about land and scary stuff. So the first is a Canadian Haida produced film called Edge of the Knife, which I think is just the most beautiful movie that's ever made, and everyone should watch it. And if you have Shudder, it's on Shudder. But it's about, it's a traditional story from the Haida community, which are folks, indigenous folks just north of where I am, up in Haida Gwaii, off of British Columbia. And it's this story of a person being extricated from the community, transforming into this kind of monstrous being called a Gagid, but then being restored into the community. So I think it's a really beautiful text in that it offers this kind of hopeful narrative. Less hopeful, but also just a great, can't talk about it enough, is the movie Clear Cut, which I believe is also on Shudder or on something adjacent. I showed it to students this term. It had Graham Greene in it, and then the week he was in The Last of Us, they all came to class and were like, Graham Greene was in The Last of Us, you have to watch it. So then I did. And it's more of a kind of traditional revenge narrative. A native guy called Arthur, who may or may not also be Wasagi Chalk, who's an Ojibwe sort of hero figure, returns, kidnaps the lawyer for the native people who's lost a suit to a logging company, and also the head of the logging company, and tortures him and all of this stuff. And it is very cathartic to watch as a native person. And almost gets right a kind of really interesting politic of revenge, but was sort of made by a Polish filmmaker that knew very little about Indigenous politics. But I still nonetheless is, I think, a really fascinating film, and Native students and non-Native students alike find it really fascinating. So teach Clear Cut, teach Edge of the Knife. They're great.
Okay, Edge of the Knife has gone straight up to the top of my watch list on Shudder. I'm watching it. Great. Dawn, have you got any?
Yes, I just saw somebody put Cocaine Bear in the chat, and I haven't seen it yet, but I want to. I guess I would recommend a TV. It's actually a British TV series called The Rig that was on Netflix in the US pretty recently. It's about a deep sea oil rig in the North Sea, and they're drilling, and they sort of discover some sort of life form under the ocean. Could be plant-like, could be there are spores involved, and at first it seems like this plant life is just simply attacking the people on the oil rig, and they intends to attack everyone and destroy humanity. But it turns out that it's actually kind of also protecting humans. So it's sensationalistic to some degree, but it's really kind of interesting also in the way it features the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Kat, what have you got for us?
Well, I already mentioned The Girl with All the Gifts, which I think is a little bit underseen, which I think is a shame, and it's got a lot in common with The Last of Us. So if you like The Last of Us, you should definitely watch The Girl with All the Gifts. But I also want to put in a shout out for Okja, Bong Joon-ho's Okja, which I feel like is one of his least liked films, but it's one I use in teaching. I find really interesting and useful for teaching about eco-criticism. It's not strictly a horror film, but I think some pretty horrible things happen to animals. So I think that a lot of children's films, actually, we could maybe call eco-horror just because lots of horrible things happen to animals in children's films, even when they're not really horror films. But if The Girl with All the Gifts is saying, oh, you think that children are the future? Here, only children exist now. Then Okja is providing maybe a bit of a more grounded and realistic take on that fallacy of the idea that children will save us. All we have to do is educate the children and they'll save us and everything will be fine, which I guess is an attitude that potentially helps us feel like we're being absolved of actually trying to save humankind if we can only instill children with good values and they'll grow up and save the world. It's, I think, a wonderful film and a very complicated one, which kind of troubles and plays with lots of those binaries between children and adults, non-human and human. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, well, as one of the generation who was traumatized by Watership Down, that you are very correct that, yeah, the children's films, how many children had their parents go, oh, it's got bunnies?
I mean, exactly. And that opens up a whole other conversation about the role of cuteness and animals and children. Basically, my argument in my chapter in the book is we find Watership people find Watership Down so shocking is because we think of rabbits as children, and when children are acting violent, we don't like that either. So yeah.
All right, Kaja.
I feel, again, because I read more, I do have one suggestion for Kat, but other people might enjoy this, but it is a book. But it is sort of about not bunnies, but hares, and it's about mushrooms, which, if you haven't read it, T. Kingfisher's retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, What Moves the Dead. I just read it, and it's really, really good. Is it fully eco-horror? Yes, kind of, but it's got fungus and very strange hares. And it is really quite unsettling, but also just some really interesting things to gender. And the other thing is, just because it's me, is I really like trolls. So anything that's got a troll in it, from a book point of view, Not Before Sundown, by Johanna Sinisalo, is absolutely amazing. I'll type all the names and everything into the chat, and then I'm assuming everyone's watched Troll Hunter. But if you haven't, like, it's just ace eco horror troll stuff, and something that I'm planning, amongst other texts, to write about in an upcoming chapter. So yeah, check out troll stuff, fairies. Sometimes the supernatural is the best place to really deal with our fears and our concerns around nature and give us a bit of space. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay, just looking in the text. I mean, we've got some recommendations also in the chat, but I don't think we've got any questions yet. I don't know if we've just done an excellent job of just solving eco horror, like we've just nailed it, or what. Well, actually, there is a question up above saying, where does Cocaine Bear fit within eco horror? Has anyone seen it? No.
I have seen it. I didn't think it was very good. Sadly. It's very much one of those classic sort of when animals attack eco horror comedy films. I also watched Lake Placid for the first time the other day, and I think it very much fits within that category. I don't know if people care about spoilers for Cocaine Bear. I mean, it's a bear, it's not a lot of cocaine. Like, what more do you need to know, really? But it ends on a sort of nice note where it's like very clear that it very clearly puts the blame on the Cocaine Bear on a human who was responsible for the cocaine being in the forest in the first place. So it's not kind of very straightforwardly being like, animals are scary, but it's also a bit sort of it's Cocaine Bear. It's not doing anything particularly groundbreaking or nuanced.
Just check.
I will jump in and do a recommendation. We've been talking a lot about Australian horror, and I really love this novel Ghost Bird by Lisa Fuller, who's an Aboriginal writer from Australia, so-called Australia. And it's just a really beautiful, it's a ghosty, there's things happen because ecological relations are not honored. It's really good. I'm trying to figure out something to write about it, but if you want an Australian Indigenous ecological novel thing, Ghost Bird. Which those birds are very creepy, and we do not have them here, and if I saw them I'd be like, yeah, that's messed up.
I would also I would shout out to The Ruins. It was a fairly mediocre film, but Scott Smith wrote the novel, and the novel is really, really, really good. And it's about this group of American tourists in Mexico who go when they're hungover to see some, old pyramid in the forest. They think they're getting off the beaten track, and they end up on this sort of temple that has a vine all over it that attacks them. It eats them, And the novel does really, really interesting things with blurring the line between plant and human consciousness, as well as really interesting things in terms of colonialism. So it's written. Scott Smith also wrote another novel that is not eco-horror, but it was made into a better film, or a better known film.
We have a question.
Okay.
All right. So whoops, and now my screen has gone. It's just disappeared. Don't make me.
Oh, A Simple Plan.
Oh, yeah.
He also wrote A Simple Plan.
Yeah. All right. How would people distinguish between eco-horror and biological sci-fi? Is this another case of the beautiful ambiguity of the Gothic genre, which perhaps encompasses eco-horror? I'm thinking of Annihilation, the Alex Garland film in particular. Anyone have any answers to that? Eco-horror and biological sci-fi.
It probably depends what conference you're trying to get your work into.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've relabeled myself 3 billion times because everything's a bit leaky and sporous, let us say, when it comes to definitions of things. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule there, but I'm sure there's tropes that you see more one than the other, but that would be my argument. So if you want to write a paper on it, just do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll second that. I mean, I'll out myself as a genre theorist who only cares about genre in particular ways. But to me, I get really uncomfortable as a Native person. I get really uncomfortable about these kinds of categorization debates, because to me they remind me of like blood quantum debates of like, well, do you have this many degrees, and does it make you eco-Gothic, or just make you this? So I think that I'm always interested in the kind of, the leakiness, the hybrid, the kind of thing that fits into it. And if you want me to say why it is one thing or the other, I will, but I will do so begrudgingly.
I really like this description of like genre categories as being leaky. I want to use that in the future. I think that's such a nice metaphor.
I've used the term fluid as well, because and also like I said, it depends on what conference you're trying to get into or what your argument is. So if my argument is that it's something, then I'll go for it.
I think for me, genre categories are interesting as kind of heuristics. It's like, let's think about what might make up the Gothic, or biological sci-fi or eco-horror, and then you think about what might make them different, but then immediately like what starts to break down between those two genre categories. And I think it gives you just new ways to think about things. I always like juxtaposing things that are different together, and reading one through the other mutually, and then you can just see new things that you might not have seen before. My answer to that question would be, though, I wonder if you couldn't even read the two almost politically. Like I wonder if biological sci-fi might be a genre that erases the real natural world by imagining it in sort of speculative other realms that don't necessarily exist. They're both interesting in and of their own right. I was just reading The Willows again by Algernon Blackwood, and it's really, that story is really interesting in that it's like, is the thing that's happening to them just the willows, or is it some sort of cosmic force that's acting through and behind the willows? And at one point, one of the characters says that the willows are just symbols. I guess if you're reading it as sort of sci-fi or cosmic fiction, the willows disappear and just become symbols of something else. If you read it as eco-horror, the willows actually exist.
Yeah, I like the idea of the heuristic. Like when I think about genre, I think it's this kind of double-sided thing, right? It's a way to kind of build community, right? It's a way to identify texts and put them in relationship to each other, and it's a way for people to be in relationship with each other around our like shared appreciation and love of this. But simultaneously, right, when taken up in particular ways, it can be a kind of keep out sign, right? It can be like, you do not fit into this space, your text does not fit into this category, therefore you are excluded. And so I'm interested in that tension, yeah. And I think the idea of I think it's related to the kind of deeper function of genre, right? There's these kind of rules that you play with and twist in order to produce a kind of new text, right? But when you are constrained by those rules rather than challenged by those rules, I think that's where things start to get messy. Right? Yeah.
We've got a question wondering if any of you had any opinions on the eco-Gothic and other media such as video games. I saw someone above mention some amazing games that might touch on the genre, and with the recent popularity of The Last of Us, this was on my mind. Any gamers?
I mean, the one game that I'm sort of quasi interested in because it represents indigeneity is Until Dawn, and it does have a kind of eco-horror bent. It's about, it's a classic slasher, so you play as a set of teenagers that go up to this mountain to go on vacation, and one by one they are killed by both a slasher and by a Wendigo, who is, spoilers for the game, is their reanimated friend. And so I'm interested in, and there's all this kind of absent indigenous presence in that game that I'm really interested in. Like on the cabin walls, there's all these pictures of indigenous people. And of course, there's a Wendigo, there's multiple Wendigos, but there's no indigenous peoples. It's also set in territories that are not Anishinaabe territories. And also it has totem poles in it. So it's this kind of like mishmash of soup of like, let's put every indigenous thing in there and mix it up. So I'm interested in that game for people to check out. There's some playthroughs of it online.
Yeah, and we've got a question here. The films the panel have discussed are largely present set or event futuristic in their sci-fi leanings. This seems a natural fit given eco-horror's capacity for warning humans about the inevitable fallout of their actions and our impending demise. But does anyone have any thoughts on or examples of eco-horror set in the past? Is there any valuable connection between eco-horror and history, pastness?
I mean, yes. But like, again, like a lot of this is in part, like I've argued things that like Dracula is got huge elements of eco-horror. Like he comes back as a wolf. We'd already killed all the wolves. He's basically, it's reverse colonization, but through the form of wolves that we destroyed. And that is a really conservative text, which is very much about, we need to control every boundary, literal national boundaries, and the boundaries between life and death and animal and human and all sorts of things. And I think this is kind of the thing where it's, we always want to remember, like, we always want to think about like, oh, the future and what eco-horror can tell us and what eco-Gothic can tell us. But at the same time, a lot of what I've been reading, because I read I looked at quite a the older texts, they're just really unpleasant and reactionary. Like Henri Beaugrand's The Werewolves, which is a written text again, is just horribly racist. And it hates everyone, and it is born of an author who has been seeped in like early settler colonizer narratives about the wild beasts and the wild men and all sorts of things. So I think all it can really tell us or show us is maybe the roots of where this fear comes from and what we maybe need to be honest with ourselves about and uncover. And it's made me doing my research has made me a lot more sort of political about how we treat animals. And I'm now far more disinclined to engage with people who think it's a good idea to hunt foxes, which I wasn't to begin with, but now I'm like, yeah, we did the same thing with foxes in this country. That's the only scary animal I can think of. We have adders and foxes, and they kill very few people, if anyone. And sometimes we think cats sleep on babies. They don't. But that would be, yeah, read the past stuff because it's upsetting, but you need to kind of know how we got here.
And I mean, definitely, I'm in the very early stages of my book, but yeah, the fact that I'm looking at revenge it's all to do with history, because there's a lot to I think it's I think so much of eco horror is we're kind of being held to account to what we have done or what has been done. So it's very, history is always kind of very central. Someone also mentioned a field in England, which could be just want something set in the past.
One thing, the film I recommended, Edge of the Knife, is set in the past. It's set right on the sort of cusp of colonization for the Haida. And there's actually characters that reappear later on in the film that are kind of signaling through clothing that maybe they've gone to residential school. But what I'm really interested in that film is sometimes I think about it as this kind of like a temporal text that could occur anytime. It could have occurred thousands of years ago. It could have occurred 100 years ago, or it could have occurred today. And I think a lot of Indigenous stories have that kind of quality, right? Like, to go back to my reading of like, I could wake up tomorrow and be a buffalo. And for me, I think that quality comes from those stories are pedagogical, right? And they speak to giving us lessons for how to live in the world and how to live with each other. And it shows that Indigenous folks had this understanding of what are the correct protocols 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and that those protocols are still going to be relevant to us today or 1,000 years in the future, given that we're not all turned into like big mushroom people by then, or buffaloes.
We had a question. Please, could Dawn talk a little about the Walking Dead post-apocalyptic landscape from an eco-horror perspective? I feel the hostility of the landscape where nature takes back control in overgrowing and destroying cities and never really providing safe spaces becomes just as dangerous as the zombies. You're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I clicked that. I actually stopped watching The Walking Dead quite a while ago. It kind of stunned me when I saw a commercial and realized the fear of The Walking Dead was still ongoing. But that was one of the things that interested me about The Walking Dead, and I'm sure increasingly as it goes along. But I guess what interests me now is the ways in which those kind of apocalyptic landscapes are actually in our present as well. I mean, a phrase I've started using recently that quite a few critics have used, days of destruction and days of revolt, is one place where I think it's used particularly well, is how so much of our land has been turned into a sacrifice zone. That book considers the mountains of West Virginia that have been just mined in particularly destructive ways. And I think we see sacrifice zones everywhere where land has been kind of laid to waste, rendered abject by sort of the extractive industries and every kind of industry and urban living. And so I think it's interesting to sort of focus our attention on that and the ways in which that kind of reflects on the humans around it is horrifying rather than sort of the landscape itself is horrifying. But I think those are really interesting spaces in terms of eco-horror.
And we've got a question from Chip. For a political eco-horror author playwright, where might one start looking for resources about updating eco-horror tropes and themes in a respectful and responsible way? Do you have any recommendations for literature that analyzes eco-horror specifically from an anti-speciesist lens? So if anyone has any recommendations, I know Kaja, you've put something already in there, but if anyone has any, I think that's a really good question. How we can educate ourselves and think about eco-horror in this particular way.
I mean, I'll recommend again, Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians. Cherie Dimaline has 2 novels, one that's post-apocalyptic called The Marrow Thieves, and another that's like an adult fiction piece that has a figure called a Rougarou, which is kind of like a Métis werewolf, called Empire of Wild. It's a really beautiful text. And then in terms of like theoretical stuff, Billy Ray Belcourt, who's a Cree scholar up in so-called Canada, has written a couple really wonderful pieces thinking about the connections between speciesism and colonialism that I recommend. And then if you want to get real anti-speciesist, I recommend the work of George Tink Tinker. He has this really beautiful article called "The Rocks Shall Cry Out," where he talks about the sentience of rocks and mountains. So if you want to get really even beyond species into like landy stuff, his work is just amazing.
That's great. Would you mind, Kaylee, putting those names in the chat?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Kaja, have you got any?
I guess one of the things that I know Timothy Morton's come up, and I really enjoy his work. Although it does help if you're in a slightly altered state, so have a drink or a smoke or something and then read his work. It just makes things make more sense. But there's one paper that I really loved, and it's reasonably old, and you can get it on academia.edu, and it's called "Of Swamp Dragons, Mud, Mechalopolis, and a Future for Eco-Criticism." And it's by a theorist called Anthony Liu, which I probably pronounced terribly, Lioi. And I just really liked it because it was just like, look, there's beauty in the mud and in the slightly polluted spaces outside cities. We don't need to have grand wilderness, or, you know, it doesn't have to be pure. And I really find hybridity like a really interesting, exciting future for this kind of thing, because I like werewolves. But that was one particular text, and I'll put that in the chat that I found really useful. I think I've located a link, so I'll share that. And
Dawn, did you?
Yeah, I put it in the chat. The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet is an amazing book. It's divided into two sections, and you have to turn the book around to read one section from the back and one from the front, and it's called Ghosts and Monsters, the two sections. But it really troubles the distinctions between species. I mean, if somebody is looking for that in particular, and it's written by a whole bunch of different interdisciplinary scholars, including scientists, but the writing is really accessible. So it's pretty amazing. And then Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway, I think it's one of her more recent books. She has a great chapter in there on a sort of tentacled being that also really troubles the idea of separate species.
Yeah. We've still got time, because there's something that definitely is for Kaja, I think. It's from Clem. Says, I've been doing some work on wolves in anime recently. This talk has given me some different perspectives. One of the texts I've been working on, Wolf's Reign from 2003, could definitely be considered eco-horror. A lot of my recent work has explored the destruction of wolves and the environment in relation to the persecution of Indigenous people in Asia. It would be interesting to look into other anime that fit in this area. Has anyone explored eco-horror in a Japanese context?
So I'm almost certain that someone's looked at eco-horror in a Japanese context, but I don't really know anime that well. What I can say is you should have my contact details. Please feel free to DM me, because what I could possibly do is maybe just chat like boring things like methodological frameworks. And my reading is very much in like West and North America. But I think what you're talking about is something that there is a lot of methodological framework, and I'd be happy to share that with you. So please just DM me and we can see what we can do.
But yeah, I think we'll leave it there. This has been an amazing conversation. And yeah, I feel very selfish that I've got so much stuff from my book that I can now go and steal from, I guess. It's just the but yeah, thank you so much to Kaja, Kat, Dawn, Kaylee. This has been an amazing discussion, and hopefully we can all go off, and we've got lots of recommendations. So I guess we can leave it there. Laura.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for such a fantastic panel. Really, really interesting discussion. And I'm sort of suspecting the reason the questions were slow in coming was that you'd covered so much, and it was really fascinating. Thank you. So our next event, I think Shelley posted in the chat, at the end of April. will be on Stephen King adaptations. So we'll look forward to that one, and we'll post more information about that on our socials in due course. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming and for fantastic discussion. And thank you to Dawn, Kat, Kaylee, and to Kaja, who's disappeared somewhere, for a fantastic chat, and to Lindsay for such excellent, interesting sharing as well. Thanks very much, everybody, and I wish you all sweet dreams and no being overtaken by fungi or whatever.
Thanks very much. It was really a great experience.
Lovely to have you. Thanks very much, everybody.